We can't gather in person this year, but we've adapted. The 2020 Milwaukee Film Festival brings the best in film from across the globe and around the corner. And this year, it's all virtual, so the films and events are coming directly to you. Join us for the 2020 Milwaukee Film Festival, October 15th through the 29th. More information is at mkefilm.org/MFF.
Hi, welcome to Day 5 of the Milwaukee Film Festival, the virtual Milwaukee Film Festival. I'm Karina Henderson, presented by Associated Bank. I get in trouble if I don't say that, mostly by me. I'm Karina Henderson. I'm Marketing Director for Milwaukee Film. Just a couple of quick notes before we get started with introducing our panel. First of all, if you have been watching some of our 196 wonderful films this year, don't forget to go back and vote for the Alan H. Budd and Suzanne L. Seelig Award, the Audience Award, to pick your favorite. You can rate any film that you've watched. Please don't stuff the ballot box. We're going to talk about things like that a little later. And then if you've not seen it, we have a double up challenge going right now. It is thanks to the generosity of Judith McGregor and Dick Galloon. If we raise $75,000 during the festival, they're going to double it. And, you all know it's been a hard year for arts and culture organizations. So if you can help us meet this goal, we're about 61% of the way there, give or take. And that would be great. Just go to mkefilm.org/doubleup and you'll find all the information. All right, let's get going with tonight's conversation. We're going to talk about The Reunited States. It is a film that is playing in our festival, obviously. It is also a book, and it is almost kind of a movement. If you watch the film and take part in this conversation, I think you're going to find out a little bit more about that. So let's get our panelists in here. There we go. Get other people on screen here with me. Come on. All right. Panelists, why don't you just introduce yourselves real quick? Mark, let's start with you.
I'm Mark Gerzon. I had the pleasure of writing the book, The Reunited States of America, back in 2015, 2016, and then getting to write about Steven Olikara, who you're about to meet, and then meeting Ben Rekhi, who made this remarkable film. So I'm delighted to be with you. Thanks for inviting us to Milwaukee.
Thank you, Mark. Steven, you're in Milwaukee. Tell us about yourself.
Yes, I'm in Milwaukee. Thank you, Karina, and thank you to Milwaukee Film. I'm Steven Olikara. I'm the founder and CEO of the Millennial Action Project. I'm one of the subjects in the film. Got to work with Ben, the director, for over a year of taping this. And just as a local, I grew up loving the Milwaukee Film Festival, and it's very, very meaningful to now be here as part of a film. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And Ben?
Yes, nice to meet everyone. I'm Ben Rekhi, the director of the film. And, we made this film starting 2 years ago and never could have imagined how timely and relevant it would become. It took me to all corners of the country, including places I hadn't been before, like Milwaukee, a couple of times. And so I'm really excited to play the film to local audiences in Milwaukee, a city I'm very fond of. And I know it's been through a lot in the past several months, like many places in the country. But yeah, Steven, had mentioned this festival to me almost a year ago and said, we got to play at Milwaukee. It's one of the best festivals and a really animated crowd. So true to our word, we're actually here and really excited to have this discussion.
Great, thank you. That crowd, they're animated, they're out there somewhere, but they're really excited, I promise you.
We feel the energy, we feel it.
Yeah, we're just glad to be here running a festival, and very just delighted to have all of you. I want to start out with Mark real quick, because the book is what started the film, which is what started this conversation, and give a mouse a cookie and whatever. But the book, Ben, you just said nobody could have predicted it. Mark did. Mark kind of predicted what was happening in America. Mark, tell us about this. Just what were you sensing that led you to write this book in the first place? Because this came out in early 2016, before the election of that year and everything that's happened since.
Well, I'll let you say that I'm the predictor, but I'll also say there's been a movement that's been building for years. And so in a way, Steven predicted it, and also, as we'll see, Ben predicted it, because he had the idea for the film before he even knew about the book. So it's a little bit like one of those phenomenons, you see in some of these movies where everybody's getting the same vision at the same time. I'm thinking of that movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, if you remember that, where everybody's having the same vision of extraterrestrials coming to South Dakota. So it doesn't take a lot, however. I don't want to. It doesn't take a lot to predict increasing polarization in America, because I've been watching it closely since 1992. And if you divide that, number of years by 4, you've seen how many election cycles I've seen, and every one seemed to get worse than the next, worse than the last. Excuse me, worse than the last. And so, I think what I saw, Karina, was that, the metaphor that I used, and I used it, I think, first in 1996, was that the Congress of the United States was falling apart in the mid-90s, and they asked me to design the retreats. And it was falling apart, and they literally had a retreat where they all went off to Hershey, Pennsylvania for a weekend to focus on their relationships. And that was like the Congress people themselves saying the red light is on the dashboard of democracy. We need to add oil to democracy, oil being trust and respect for each other. And we didn't add oil. We didn't add oil in the 2000 election. That was acrimonious. We didn't add oil during the Bush years. Liberals hated Bush. We didn't add oil during the Obama years because a lot of conservatives hated Obama, and boy, did they hate Hillary. And then along comes Trump, who pours gasoline on the fire. So it's been getting worse for at least a quarter of a century. And that's why I'm so excited about the work that Steven and the other folks in the film are doing. That's why I'm so excited about Ben, because this movement, which has been building for a quarter century, has never had a movie like the one that Ben has made. It's never had it. And so it's the first time that, your viewers and other Americans can say, oh, there is an other way of being politically active. Because right now it's like you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, or you're apathetic. No, there's actually another option, which is that you can be engaged and really try to solve problems rather than take sides. So let's meet Steven and Ben and hear more.
Yeah, Ben, I think it's a good time to throw it to you. Just if as Mark said, you were thinking about this before you even started the film and considering these issues, before he even wrote the book and considering these issues. What was on your mind as you were conceiving the film?
Well, I should add, Mark, has been working on this sort of transpartisan movement for almost 30 years. And so I think the kind of wisdom he's accumulated, it is sort of prophetic in some ways to have predicted, this moment that now everyone recognizes that polarization is an issue. I don't think that was as strong 4 years ago. And Mark, one of the things that he kind of talked about in the book was the end of the Cold War as being the precipitation of our internal divisions. And that moment, when Reagan shook hands with Gorbachev, while it was a significant moment of peace and turning a new chapter in history, that animosity towards an outside enemy had to go somewhere. And it turned around on itself inside, and we made enemies of our fellow citizens. And that's the trend that, arguably kind of started this internal division when we lost a common enemy. And so for me, it was, I guess like a lot of people after the 2016 election kind of woke up to the reality that there were bubbles and that we were living in two different countries and maybe not realizing it. And I think that for me, it was a real opportunity to say, how can the work that I do help navigate this new reality and tell stories that would, reflect what was happening? A lot of people say that filmmaking is telling a story, but I think filmmaking is also deeply listening to stories and sharing them with an audience. And so it really got me interested into nonfiction filmmaking. And I did a series for PBS before this called The Hidden Vote that was about minorities who support Trump. And it was Muslims for Trump and LGBT for Trump, and just really challenging the preconception that there was one type of phenomenon that got us here, that this is a really complicated situation, and that there's no community is monolithic. There were a lot of groups that, supported this president that might not have been so intuitive on the surface, but show how complex our electorate are. And I really wanted to use media as a way to amplify voices that weren't being heard. And, media, it's clear now, has been used to divide us, but it can also be part of what brings us back together. And so that led me to the journey of making this film. And it was really when I saw Susan Bro speak that I was struck by her simple message of, we need to work through our differences or we're going to have more violence. And for someone who's lost her daughter and suffered, one of the worst tragedies anyone can go through, to come out with that message when she could have been consumed by grief or by anger, to have this profound wisdom that is so in need right now, really struck me and kind of like slapped me in the face that what was I doing being so petty with my emotional outrage? Like, are there more productive means that we can amplify these messages? And so that set me on the journey. And of course, meeting Mark really helped frame it, because through Mark, I met Steven and a few other people in the film, the Levertons, and Greg Orman. And so that was, Mark and I's collaboration with him as a consulting producer was sort of pointing and guiding the process, and always, framing it in a way that would make it more accessible to audiences.
Yeah. Steven, tell us a little bit about your journey. How'd you get here? Not just your involvement in the film, but starting the projects and programs that you have.
Yeah, well, first of all, again, very grateful and honored to be here, and thank you to Ben and Mark for including me as part of this film. I grew up in an immigrant family just outside of Milwaukee in Brookfield. My parents came from India, and getting involved in politics or public service was not a prescribed career path when we were growing up. I think for most people in my family, engineering was what you were supposed to do. But as a musician here, I discovered my life calling as a bridge builder, because I played in so many different types of bands. And I saw how my jazz friends, my hip hop friends, my rock and roll friends, and I did have this band. I had a klezmer band, so I had klezmer friends as well. And seeing the connections across those different people and groups, but also the connections across those different cultures. And when that took place in the context of the most racially segregated metro area in the country, I realized that these types of collaborations were leading to better music. And we were all better because we listened to each other. And those were the core ingredients of what became the methodology behind MAP. It was all about, in the musical sense, about listening and improvisation and call and response. I realized those musical principles were needed more than ever in our democracy that was becoming more and more divided. So when my friends and I started thinking about launching Millennial Action Project, it was premised on two forces that we thought would most shape the future of our democracy. One is the rise of millennials and Generation Z into our politics, not just as voters, but increasingly as elected officials. And then the second trend being the one that Mark spoke about, which is this worsening polarization that's taken place most acutely perhaps during our lifetime in the past 30 years or so. And so the question then becomes, how is this generation going to govern our country when those two trends collide? And that led to Millennial Action Project, which we now operate across the entire country in Congress, as well as in 30 state legislatures where we have chapters. And really where we focus is activating young elected officials across party lines. We have Democrats, Republicans, and independents who are looking for that alternative path that Mark mentioned earlier. So often you hear this narrative about millennials being apathetic, but I see the exact opposite with young people who have the highest service participation rates in our country, who are rejecting so much of what we're seeing in our politics, and yet shaking the conscience of our country to say, hey, we need to do something about climate change and racial justice and gun violence. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful for because of that. And through our work, we've actually seen a number of results that I'm sure we can talk about later, where our leaders actually have crossed the divide to get things done. So when Ben reached out to me by way of Mark about being involved in the film, I was looking for some type of media, and I'm a huge fan of documentaries in general, that would start to tell this alternative story that you don't really get in the mainstream media. And that's why I think this film can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, it is powerful. And just going to note now, and probably 20 times later, if you haven't seen it yet, please do watch it. I want to, before we get to all these millennials and these Gen Zs, cynical Gen Xer here, I warned you. I want to take a little jump back in history. And there's a quote at the beginning of the film that I kind of carried with me through the film a little bit as well. And it's from Thomas Jefferson. It says, "The greatest good we can do our country is to heal its party divisions and make them one people," which sounds really great. And Jefferson was so good at sounding really great. But this quote was from a letter written right after one of the dirtiest presidential campaigns in history, still 1800. It was just a knockdown, drag-out war. And of course, we could go on and on for a while about Jefferson himself and who he considered people and who he considered less than people and things like that, slave owner. There's a lot of complexity to Jefferson. But this quote, just in that context of an election where bridges were burned, where norms were challenged and changed, and then he comes out and says, "Oh yeah, no, we totally got to heal." Is that something that just, how does that strike all of you just in that historical context? And just thinking about that too, is this time different from anything that we've really experienced in politics, where there have been histories of just dirty campaigns and freaking civil war? What is there something different about this time that's really unique, or is this something that just kind of ebbs and flows throughout American history?
I'll just jump in because the choice of the line at the beginning of the film, I think, is what prompted this. One of the things that really struck me as I started to work with people like Mark and Steven, who have dedicated a lot of energy towards building bridges, is this historical perspective. Many of the founding fathers talked about, division and factionalism, from Washington to Madison, Jefferson. So the idea that you could read this quote in 2020 and it's as relevant now as it was in 1790 is to give a little bit longer view that, look, we've been through this before, and this is a challenge that we've always faced. And sometimes, we can look back and see the wisdom of our founders, that they saw this coming and that they knew that we were going to be in these moments. And, as troubling as it is, it's also somewhat reassuring that, this is something that repeats over time, but also was seen ahead of time and predicted. It makes it feel like a little bit more like, okay, we knew this moment was coming and now we're here. And so, there are obviously, it was a different time. And I think, Jefferson, you're right, by 2020 standards would have very questionable moral implications. But the wisdom of, going through those divisive periods and being able to come out the other side with the universal truth, which is this country is made up of, all different cultures and all different religions. And it's the grand experiment of humanity. And unless we find a way to make that work here, where is there hope for that pluralism? And so I would kick it over to Steven and Mark to talk a little bit more about that kind of historical perspective. But there's a lot of wisdom there that I find reassuring.
Yeah, I'll just jump on the bandwagon there and agree with you and say that the back of the book, the quote that I have at the top of the page is the motto of the United States of America, which is E pluribus unum, which comes from the very beginning of our culture. So Ben is right. They knew right from the beginning, out of many one. Can we do that? And you're right, Karina, that it ebbs and flows. But I've worked in cultures all over the world for the United Nations that were involved with political strife, and in some cases political violence, and in some cases civil war. And what I've noticed is that it's a universal human struggle. But to say that it's always there and it's always the same is like being blind. If you live in Milwaukee, the seasons are not all the same, and this political seasons are not all the same. And right now we're in a season of a wildfire of polarization. It's out here, it's wildfire of polarization. Somewhere else, maybe it's a hurricane of polarization. But there's an extremity now to what's happening. And I think most Americans can feel that. So regardless of whether your viewers are Trump supporters or Biden supporters, whether they consider themselves conservative or liberal, I don't think anybody's going to say, oh, yeah, it's just like it was 10 years ago, because it's not. So what's the key ingredient in making, the unum out of the pluribus? And I'm going to read a quote, another quote, not from Thomas Jefferson, but it says, one of the most difficult things is not to change society, but to change yourself. Now, that's not Marianne Williamson. That's Nelson Mandela. All right. The most difficult thing is to change yourself. Now, this is a man who led a revolution in South Africa. And he said the most difficult thing is to change yourself. And I think what's great about the film is that it's a call to the viewer to say, you can complain as much as you want about the Electoral College or, media or Twitter, but what are you doing? What are your own attitudes? How are you reaching out across the divide? How do you deal with that uncle or that aunt or that brother or sister who differs from you? And so the chance to practice the skills, which maybe we can talk more about in this time, what are the skills? And I'd actually like to ask Steven, when you see these legislators that you work with, some rise to the occasion and join Millennial Action Project and say, let's work across the divide. Somebody just their own age, same town, is playing the polarization game. And what have you seen in this incredible network you've built? What are some of the qualities and skills of those legislators who reach across the divide as opposed to those who widen the divide?
Well, I think one of the most common themes is just, I call it the sixth gear of leadership, which is where you go to a new place of purpose and clarity of vision, where the political costs and risks of reaching out across the divide to form a cross-partisan coalition, become less important, and certainly less important than the actual mission of what you're trying to achieve. And I think one commonality among a lot of young people who run for office at a young age generally did so because there is an issue that they feel very passionately about that is going unaddressed. And so for them, they're not necessarily thinking about what are all of the political, compromises and calculations that I can make in order to stay in office for 40 years. It's more of a mindset of what needs to be done to solve this problem that has gone unaddressed in my community. And many of them who even run as Democrats or Republicans and have that party label next to their name still say that the issue is more important than the party. And that is emblematic of the generation as a whole, where studies show that millennials are the most independent generation and they really focus on issues as opposed to partisan identities. So that to me makes me very hopeful. But just to also respond to your point, Karina, about this historical context of where do we stand right now, I think there's certainly been an increase in the past 30 years. And for millennials who've come of age during that time, they've only known a polarized and broken government. But also, if you go further back than that, there's a sense that even when there was bipartisanship, it was still leaving out a number of marginalized communities, many communities of color. And so I think the mindset we have in our organization is how do we create a new type of democracy, a new type of path that does live up to the E Pluribus Unum mission that our founders articulated. I think what was genius about Jefferson, Madison, and Washington is not that they were perfect human beings and not that they were totally consistent in their daily habits, but they could kind of see what the future should be before they could even do it themselves. And they had a vision for a large and diverse democracy. Madison talked about this in the Federalist Papers. And we became more diverse than Madison ever thought we would become diverse. But he felt that if we had well-designed institutions and, as he described, enlightened leaders, that diversity would become the solution to the factionalism that Ben was speaking of. And it is amazing when you read these documents, the letters that Jefferson and Madison sent, George Washington's farewell address, where they were just scholars of human behavior, and they knew that extreme factionalism would ultimately become an existential threat to our democracy. And that's where we sit today. That's why I think this film taps into something that we all feel in our hearts right now, we know that this level of demonization and hatred that we express to people is ultimately not sustainable for a diverse democracy to exist over the long term. When 2/3 of Americans see people of the other political party as not just being different, but being fundamentally evil and a threat to this country, well, that explains a lot of the tribal behavior that we're seeing today. So we need people who can call our country to a higher order. But again, I think part of the film, it's not just people who you see on television. It's each of us have that responsibility. Each of us have that agency to make a choice. Mark has this amazing line in the film where, he kind of responds to the question of what can we all do to be part of the solution? And he says, look, we can make a choice every day. Do we approach a conversation with suspicion, or do we approach it with empathy? And if we can choose that latter path, then we do have a chance for this country to become the first ever successful, diverse democracy in human history. And that would be incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get back to some of that on the choices that we all can make and how can we all affect change and work towards solutions. And I love the context that you all gave, and just made me think, Madison, one of the bits of his genius was that he built in the factions. He knew that there would be warring factions and warring interests, and he built that into the structure of our federal government in order to try to contain it and just institutionalize it rather than letting it get in wild and out of control. And unfortunately, it seems like we're a little bit beyond where it's contained into the system. And there are folks who are in power and in the power structure, and that they're in power because of those divisions, because they are working on fomenting those divisions and fueling them. Some of the folks in the film talked about that. And so I want to talk a little bit about how do we stay active and involved and fight for what we believe is right without crossing the line into hate. And I know that's something that, Steven, you mentioned you wanted to talk about, but this is really just for everybody. There was a note on Susan Bro's wall in the film that was very clear. And it said, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And so, Ben, you talked about her as being so compassionate and understanding, but then she's talking about this righteous anger that is necessary in order to affect change in our country. Where does the righteous anger get less righteous and get to a point where it's just anger and hatred and division? Or is there an essential difference between the anger you feel, the outrage you feel toward working for justice and fairness, and the anger that is being fueled up and stirred up and gasoline on the fire right now amongst ourselves and turning inward amongst other people who are really all our neighbors?
Yeah, well, I can jump in on that. I think that this is a profound question to bring up, Karina. So I really do applaud you for bringing this up, because in an era where we're dealing with questions of racial equality, for example, there is a lot of righteous anger, and there's a lot of hatred out there, and we have to, as a society, figure out how we're going to sort this all out. I really draw from Dr. King, where he talked about radical love, and he had this great line. He said, the enemy is oppression, not people who are conducting the oppression. And the reason why he said that is because even for people we disagree with, even for people who don't even see us fully as human beings, there is a great need in a democracy in order to see what Dr. King called agape love in us and in other people, which is not an affectionate love. He never said we need to like everyone, but he said we need to love everyone. And that's on a different level, where we are expressing our highest form of charity to all human beings, understanding that we're all children of God. And that type of radical love is so hard. I mean, it goes counter to many human tendencies. But it's not only something that is good for us, because Nelson Mandela found a way to forgive people who jailed him for 30 years and ultimately build towards a more reconciled government in South Africa. But also, it's good just practically speaking, because we in this country largely cannot move major changes without building a new form of consensus across our lines of difference. And the reason why I think King and I add John Lewis to that methodology as well were so effective in that approach of radical love is because they not only were changing laws, they knew they had to change hearts and minds as well. And so I think where we need to distinguish between these two concepts is one, having a very clear-eyed view of the systemic injustices and the systemic problems in our society, and be willing to have the courage to speak directly to those. That's the kind of radical vision that people like a King would have. But also, we have to understand that we need to be bridge builders at the same time, that in this country, you need diverse coalitions in order to create real change. And that's where the love and the empathy and the compassion comes in, even where it's difficult, even when it hurts. And so that once you start to see other human beings as less than human, people who truly have contempt for, then that's where I think we really have to stop ourselves and say, how can we reflect on a better approach? Because when we're expressing hate for other people, that distorts our own personality. That really distorts our own sense of love and compassion. And I think, Jefferson would often say, when you really have that much hatred, you just need to take a moment and take a breather. Because what you're going to say when you're that agitated is not going to be as good as what you say after you've taken a few deep breaths. So I know it's really hard. One of my mentors said, bridge building is not rocket science. It's much harder than that. And this is exactly why it's very difficult.
That's beautiful, Steven. That's beautiful. That's inspiring. And I'll just pick up from the John Lewis, and because I was thinking before you mentioned John Lewis, that the companion, documentary that people should watch The Reunited States, and then watch Good Trouble, the documentary about John Lewis. Look at the title. I think the title is the answer, Karina, to your question. He didn't say make trouble. He said make good trouble. And there's a difference between good trouble and looting a store. And he was a perfect exemplar of what Steven was talking about. And I'll say, use the phrase in your question, righteous anger. That's different than self-righteous anger. Righteous anger means you're righteous about a bigger cause than yourself. Self-righteous means you've become, as my mother used to say, too big for your britches. You're kind of like, you're getting inflated. You're getting to be arrogant. You're getting to be condescending. So the reason I think we're mentioning people like Mandela and King and John Lewis is because, and this is where it gets tricky, is because they knew what they were fighting against. They were fighting against racism, and they could be righteous about it because what was wrong was clear. What's happened now, to going back to your earlier question about how is the moment different, people are confused. What are we fighting against now? What's the great threat? And of course, racism is still there. It's a clarifying thing. But about a lot of other issues, the internet, what to do about Twitter, and how do we make the internet more just place? What do we do with the economy? Should we fight against all this inequality, or does the inequality, is there a trickle-down economy? There are genuine disagreements that people get confused about, and there's not this clear right versus wrong. And when you're not in that clear right versus wrong, where it's obvious who the enemy is, when it's a structural problem that's complicated, like climate change or the internet or the economy or immigration, these are complicated issues. Having exactly the qualities that Steven was talking about, I think, is essential, because you have a piece of the answer in your heart and your soul. You have a piece of the answer, and that's where your power should come from. You have a piece. Be proud of that. But remember, it's a piece of the answer, and somebody else has another piece, and someone else has another piece. And that's, I think, to me, that's the way I've seen it. If you said to me right now, if I could make the right in America disappear, if I could make conservatives disappear, Would I wave my magic wand and make them disappear? No. And if you said I could make liberals disappear, would I want them to disappear? No. I think they're there for a reason. And I notice that I'm using my two hands as I speak. We have two hands for a reason. We have two eyes for a reason. We have, two ears and two hemispheres of our brain for a reason. And I think we've got two different perspectives, more than two, obviously, liberal and conservative. And it's a dance. It's a dance, and we need to play it more skillfully. And Ben has captured that in the film because he, some folks who are not on with us, the Levertons, he decided, and he could have picked anybody in the world to make the central kind of continuous theme of his film. He picked the Levertons, who were basically a right-of-center Republican family, and we follow them through the film, and they really take us home. They take us home. Steven and Susan Bro and others are in the film and a very important part of it, including Greg Orman, who ran for governor in Kansas. But it's this right-of-center family that kind of goes, oh, we just don't really see the full picture. And Ben captured that beautifully. He made and I'll pass you the baton here, Ben. You made the decision how to hold the film together and give it its emotional power by not trying to do 10, 12, 15 characters, but by doing 4 or 5 characters and really digging deep. And I think that's a filmmaking decision that, Karina, you take where you want, but I'd love to hear Ben talk a little bit about what was it like in his head for making that filmmaking decision, because it really shaped why the film has its emotional power.
Well, and yeah, I do want to hand it off to Ben, and I think this is perfect timing, because one of the things I did want to ask about is that and talking about Steven and Mark, the skills that you can build in order to come to the table with something that is more than just trying to win and trying to beat the other guy, but actually trying to build something that is something more like what you believe in. We see all this stuff on such a grand scale, but the most powerful things that happened, especially with the Levertons in the film, were the power of the small, and the power of the small stories, and those moments, those interactions where people just laid bare their stories. And that is what that's what they carried with them most powerfully, rather than these large shouting crowds. It's these small stories. And Ben, I wanted to talk to you about just the power of sharing people's stories and being immersed in them. And is that maybe a clue? Is that a step to what we can do to be bridge builders?
Yeah, it absolutely is. Just to thread the needle on the anger question, just because this is something I struggled with a lot myself, is, you mentioned Susan quote, the Susan's quote from the film, which was actually something her daughter said frequently. And her daughter has kind of become like an inspiration for her. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. I think the tricky thing with anger is that it has a destructive quality to it and a self-destructive quality to it. And it can cause us to harm other people and harm ourselves. And so as an inspiration, it's highly useful. But anger, I heard this great quote once, that anger is the difference between how we want reality to be and how it actually is. And, the other thing with anger is it's the secondary emotion. It's not, it comes from fear or from sadness. And so you can't cure anger. You have to cure what's beneath it. I mean, anger is what got us here. The reason, we have the president that we do is there was a lot of anger that wasn't being addressed in this country. And you can't fight anger with anger. And so when we talk about bridge building, it's not necessarily like, let's make peace and let's get along. But it is, if you feel that call to action, how do you channel that into something productive rather than spewing more venom? Because we all have a decision to make. Are we going to be uniters or dividers? And so for me, anger is useful up to a point. But as soon as it takes control of me, I've lost control. And so I never want to lose control, especially in this moment, although we often all do. Solutions and talking to people. I think, one of the biggest things I would say, and this kind of relates to, friends and family and coworkers, is don't go into a conversation about politics trying to change someone's mind. Go into a conversation to learn where they're coming from. And that simple shift of like, instead of being like, yeah, but don't you understand? It's like this, and I'm here to educate you, and I know all the facts, and like, you're getting it wrong. Like, listen, like if you can just, what I do is I go into interview mode and I say, that's interesting. Where did that come from? oh, like that's interesting too. What made you think that? And for me, it's incredibly useful to understand how other people think instead of trying to bludgeon them with my beliefs. And I think like there's a Bill Doherty at the Braver Angels, which is a group of family counselors that apply their skills to political divisions, came up with a simple acronym that has changed my life in these conversations called LAPP, L-A-P-P. Listen, acknowledge, pivot, perspective. So when you hear something that you don't agree with, listen to it, acknowledge it with some kind of, that I heard what you said. Is this what you meant? Pivot to, have you thought about it a different way? And then offer your perspective. And as soon as you start listening to people, you'll see how they've changed and they actually respect you and you can get through more. So it's actually in your best interest to listen and try and understand where they're coming from, because they'll see that you see them as a human and they'll start to see you as a human. And this shouting, it's something I feel so sad, because these are skills and challenges that, you know, we're all facing that we lack. And they're basic conversation skills that we've all forgotten along the way. And so the hope with this film is just to show people that there is another way. You're never going to make 60 million people, you're never going to defeat them. They're never going to disappear. The history won't write them off. And that's how the other side thinks about this side, and vice versa. Like, we're always going to coexist. And so it's better to remember, you know, say if Biden wins this next election, not to forget what it felt like to be the underdog and the one against it, and to include those people in the conversation, because we have to get out of this mess together. We got into it together, and it's up to both of us to get out of it.
Karina, what?
That's hard. That's so hard.
What Ben
Sorry,
is saying,
Steven, go ahead.
What he reminds me of is there's a dialogue series we did here in Milwaukee for 2 years. We started in Milwaukee, then we went statewide, called Red and Blue Dialogues. And the idea was to bring together community members and elected officials across the political divide to utilize that practice, the LAP practice that Ben mentioned. I love that acronym. We had trained facilitators who help people along on that journey. But the point of when you sit down with someone, not with the intention of owning the other person with your facts being better than their facts, but instead trying to understand, something really powerful happens. And I'll never forget, we did a dialogue on criminal justice reform here, and we would intentionally curate the tables to be politically diverse, but you wouldn't know, which party they're with, and you wouldn't even know which organization they were with. And there was a liberal activist who came up to me afterwards, and she said, I just wanted to share some feedback with you, Steven, because I got to tell you, our whole table was agreeing with each other the entire night. I thought we were agreeing with each other way too much. And I told her, ma'am, thank you so much for that. But I also wanted to share that, like, you were sitting right next to the head of the Republican Party in your county, and to the other side was the head of another very conservative group. And she's like, oh my God, I can't believe I was agreeing with them, much less sitting next to them. So it just shows that when you have this different approach, you're listening and you're learning and you're evolving together in many ways, and you're going to realize that there's a lot more you have in common than meets the eye. And often, because of that, I often use this football metaphor, which is, it's not about meeting on the 50-yard line. When you go through this methodology, you're moving to a different field altogether. And that's a more transformative process.
Yeah. But again, this is hard work. This is work that we have to put in. It's so hard. Is some of what has made this moment happen the rapidity of being able to, Steven, like you said, kind of have that own ya moment and have that little quick comeback and then you just move on, because there's this volume of information and you just move on. Or even when a story does capture our attention in the media or through other channels, that is something that's designed to strike our empathy and gets to the heart of it. A photo of, a dead child on a beach, and, just moments like this, or stories of people in our own community or across the globe who are suffering and having these struggles, but then we can just move on. And so how do we retrain our brains to hold on to that moment of empathy without, 2020, a lot of us, I think, are feeling some empathy overload, compassion, just numbness, because everything that we're hearing is just these awful things that people are going through. And there are still millions of untold stories there. How do we start to retrain our brains? How do we get the dialogue to move in a different direction where it's not so easy to just move on?
Well, I'll just jump in, and I'm curious Mark's thoughts on this too. I think a big distinction for me has been distinguishing between divisions in government and divisions in citizens. I think that, like, of course, if you read something about, the Supreme Court or some policy issue and senators fighting, like, that can get your blood boiling because these 50 people on my team are, fighting your team, and it's black or white, it's red or blue, it's binary. And, we're like locked in this battle, but that's very few people, these elected officials at the very high levels. What we're concerned about and talking about more directly in the film is the divisions in public and the polarization amongst citizens. And that's 300 million people. And that's where you get into violence in the streets and, family members cutting each other off and never talking again. And that is the fabric of this country. And that leads to our elected representatives. So there's division in Congress and Senate and, the president and at the very high levels. There's division in media, which is incentivized by advertising sales and clickbait and keeping your attention. And then there's division amongst us, our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers. And if we group them all together, then it's a battle. Then it's black and white. But if we can separate and say, like one of the more dangerous comments out there I find is like, if you don't stand up to evil, you are evil, or something like that. Like it's a form of blanketing an entire group of people. Like it's so complex how we got here. And you talk about hurting. Again, I would go back to part of the reason we are where we are is because people have been hurting. Like, the reason we got this president is because there were large groups of people that were hurting financially and scared about their future and felt like they were forgotten. And they spoke up. And they rose up, and if we now just try and bash it back down into of course it's unleashed a lot of other things, but I think empathy works both ways. We have to understand the symptoms of what led us here and address those, not just replace the leader. Like that may help temporarily, but these divisions have been unearthed and they're going to continue to fester. And so for me, it's really about how we talk about each other, like public citizens on the other side. And for some reason, that distinction has helped me to keep a separation of church and state in my mind to keep my anger focused in the right places.
Yeah, Karina, I'll respond to your question by talking about something that's really intimate, which is divorce. I would imagine that people aren't thinking about divorce as they watch this film or listen to this conversation, but I'm thinking about it because I was trained as a family therapist originally, like many people in Braver Angels, and there's a category of divorces called high conflict divorces and another category called low conflict divorces. Now, in both cases, they're divorces. In both cases, they're differences. But in some cases, the high conflict divorce, they devastate each other. They devastate their children. They often devastate their finances. And the lives of both people are profoundly, wounded. And I'm sure everybody knows a couple like that. And then there are other people who, after getting married and saying they loved each other, they divorce, but they do it in a way that's amicable, respectful, caring for the kids. And, it's hard. There's hardship there. There's difficulty. There's hurt, but they work it through. And so that's the same analogy I'd use for go to your question. Have a difference with somebody, there's no greater difference, no more painful difference than divorce. But have a difference, but what serves you and those you love best? More fighting, no, less conflict, less acrimony, more empathy. So I think I would call it enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest is why people should change, because I can tell you, if I have 2 or 3 or 4 fights with my wife every day, that's not the marriage I want. And that's what politics looks like now. In fact, one of the stories I tell in the book was a chief of staff in the House of Representatives who said to me, Mark, I'm really worried. And this was 20 years ago. She said, Mark, I'm really worried that the Republicans are telling all their people to vote against everything we represent and present on the floor. And our leaders are telling us to vote against everything the Republicans are presenting. She said, I don't think that's leadership. And it's not leadership. That's just knee-jerk opposition. And people didn't enter politics. I'm sure Steven can the folks who were in his network, they didn't enter politics because they wanted to knee-jerk oppose somebody else. They entered because it was giving their life purpose and meaning, and they had a vision for what they could contribute. And so I think if we can stay on purpose, we'll shift, just going back to your question, we'll shift from that hostility to more empathy. It's our inner self, it's in our enlightened self-interest.
Yeah. We are getting low on time, and there is kind of a closing question I want to ask all of you, and we've addressed it somewhat, and I think I can predict a little bit of what all of you might say to answer this question. But I'm so just grateful that we've been able to focus on solutions in this conversation and not just wallow in the it's bad. There's so much temptation just to wallow in the fact that things are just bad right now, and that they are divisive, and there is so much out there that is fueling this divisiveness, and to see all of you so focused just in your work and even in this conversation on the good and on the solutions is just, it's wonderful to see. What I want to ask all of you just to close out here is, for a takeaway for all of us, me included, but everybody who's watching as well, and even for each other, what is the biggest thing that has to change to fix what's broken? Or you can answer it another way and think about it this way: what's the one thing we can each do in our own lives to start being bridge builders? Or you can answer both.
Well, I think Mark touched on it with his Nelson Mandela quote. It's us, ourselves. Like, we can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we react. And there are far more people that want to see us move past division and move past violence and dig ourselves out of this hole than there are people that want to continue down this downward spiral. And there's far greater numbers of those people, and that and a lot of data backs this up with, like, the More in Common study that calls 67% of Americans the exhausted majority, and that it's the extreme wings of both the political parties and also the public that are driving the sense that we're inevitably divided and that this is the reality that we're in. I disagree. I think that more of us want to see a productive solution through this. It's just not being told. Those stories aren't being told. It's not fear-driven. It's not engagement-driven. So I think before we can look outside, we have to look inside. And, this idea that we all have blind spots, I think this country, we're still in the, twilight of this racial awakening. We're still realizing all of these blind spots that we have as individuals. And I think that also works towards, people we disagree with, where we could say, if you support this president, then I don't want to have anything to do with you. Like, to me, that's not a productive part of this conversation. It's to understand, where do we find agreement? There's 5 third rail issues that will really divide people, whether it's abortion, guns, climate, and immigration. But there's 1,500 or thousands of them that we agree on. And we actually want the same things. We want safe communities. We want education for our children. We want, us to take care of our own and have a strong society. It's how we get there that we disagree on. And so let's start with what we agree on first. And for me, a lot of that just comes down to, not trying to change people's minds, listening to different types of media. I listen to a lot of conservative podcasts just to understand what a different point of view is and help incorporate it into my own thinking in terms of, like, how I approach conversations. And I would just say, if anything you're posting or anything you're saying about entire groups of people might hurt people or have, incite fear or anger or stoke division, even if you think you're on the right side of an issue or the right side of history, that may actually be putting fuel on the fire. And so each of us have a responsibility, and those are things we can start doing today and tomorrow and the next day. And that's what gives me hope, is taking in a sense of agency that we can do this together.
That's great. That really reminds me of a lot of the discussions on racial justice that have been going on this year, and being anti-racist. It's about doing the work and recognizing that you may be more of a part of the problem than you realize, with your actions and with your everyday choices, and that those small things can matter a big deal to other folks, and just start doing the work on that level. So yeah, that's really great. Steven, you were going to jump in here.
Yeah, I think it's each of those small steps that ultimately add up to a larger change. Actually, we just did a session with No Studios, which is a creative collective here in Milwaukee, run by John Ridley, the Oscar-winning director. And we just did a panel, a whole workshop.
Milwaukee Film Board member. Got to just shout that out.
Yeah, that's true. He is. Yeah. But we did a whole workshop on small steps to big change, translating vision into action. So it's this exact point that, like any big problem, you have to break it down into smaller pieces. And I think we got to look at that in two senses. One is what we do, individually in our own lives, the work that we need to do, as you mentioned, on a range of issues, and just how we operate on a daily basis in the civic space. But also, I think we have to recognize that the hyper-partisan zero-sum business model of our political industrial complex and our political media complex, in many ways, is a distortion of who we really are as a country. So we are the most diverse country in human history. And so we're going to have different ideas flying around, and we have to figure out how to represent them and reconcile different ideas out there. But what we see in the news and in the media is not an accurate reflection of what our country is. And I know that as a fact because through my job, I see both the headlines and what I call are the trend lines with our leaders. And I see which stories get a lot of attention and which stories get almost no oxygen at all. Here in Wisconsin, one of the most polarizing issues is voting. And yet we built a bipartisan coalition of sitting elected officials in the state legislature. By the way, the state legislature that's ranked as the most polarized in the entire country, to come together on the importance of safe voting, absentee ballot improvements, and just came out with a bipartisan PSA on that. That's not going to, it's getting good traction on social media, but clearly, more establishment media has not wanted to make these constructive stories as a headline making story, even though it's extremely rare. And so people need to understand that there's a lot more going on. And so my thinking here is, what's the biggest solution in terms of our political system? I think a huge part of it is looking at money and politics reform, because the business model does profit so heavily on division and conflict, but also in our own lives, because every day that we post a really, hyper-partisan contempt building tweet, for example, that might get a lot of retweets. And then so we're being rewarded for sometimes doing the wrong thing. And that gives us a dopamine rush. And I guess I'll just leave you with what Martin Luther King III said to me. I asked him about his dad, do you think how would he be using these social media platforms? And he said, my father would be using social media to express messages of love and empathy. And we have a choice every day, each of us as individuals, of how we're going to use our mediums of communication, and whether it's for good or whether it's for bad. So I think all of us have that choice to make.
Yeah, I think, Steven, if we were going to do, just before we get to you, Mark, if we were going to do the 3 or 4 hour version of this talk, we would have gotten to money and politics. We would have gotten to the zero-sum game. Those are big issues that still need exploring. And I'm glad you brought those up. But yeah, everything you said was wonderful as well. Mark, now to you. Thank you.
I'll be very brief and just say that I think the answer to your question is over Steven's right shoulder. If you look on the wall on the bookcase there's a map of
Wisconsin.
Yeah, Wisconsin. And I think I would say think Wisconsin pride. Think how can we make Wisconsin a great place to live? Stop playing the Washington ball game. Play the Wisconsin ball game, and find a new way to play the ball game, and play it the Wisconsin way. And if that's too big, play it the Milwaukee way, or the Oshkosh way, or the Kenosha way. But start caring and going small. One of my colleagues just said that. Go small. And that doesn't mean vote. Go ahead, vote for president, vote for congressman, and so forth, congresswoman. But play small and play local. The first principle of community organizing is start with who you are, what you have, and where you are. And that means think local, think real, think how could I make a difference where I am. And I'll give Martin Luther King the last word and say, when he was thrown in jail in Memphis, and this is you're in jail now. I mean that'd be a time to be really damn angry. And his letter from the Memphis jail was, our goal, remember, he said, is not victory, but reconciliation. And so he was practicing exactly what Steven and Ben and the folks in the film are talking about. That wasn't an easy thing to do from jail. I mean, I'd be really angry in jail if I'd been, and those were his closing words. So, and that's my closing words. I'll give them to Martin Luther King and just say thank you again for having us as part of the Milwaukee Film Festival, and thank you for picking this remarkable film. I really am grateful.
Well, the gratitude is ours. Mark, Steven, Ben, all of you for creating this film, for creating the book, for creating all of the work that you all have done throughout your lives in order to live what this film is talking about. And I'm inspired. This is great. I'm also inspired to get more involved. I have been thinking about getting more involved in Bayside Village politics and government. And Mark, you just really drove that point home. So I appreciate all of your time. I appreciate everything that you guys are doing, not just with this panel and not just with this film, but again, to live out everything that this film touches on. So wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much for your time and energy. Everybody who's been tuning in, thank you so much for watching and sticking with us. And go watch the film, Reunited States, if you haven't already. If you have, watch it again. Why not? It'll inspire you. All right. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful night.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And keep hope alive.
There you go. Nice.
We can't gather in person this year, but we've adapted. The 2020 Milwaukee Film Festival brings the best in film from across the globe and around the corner. And this year, it's all virtual, so the films and events are coming directly to you. Join us for the 2020 Milwaukee Film Festival, October 15th through the 29th. More information is at mkefilm.org/MFF.